She raised Keanu Reeves when no one else cared. Now, at 80, she's still scrubbing floors just to survive. He thought she was gone, until one viral story changed everything. What he does next, it's not just generous, it's life-altering. But one secret gift leaves everyone in tears, and no one saw it coming. Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The morning sun slipped through the sheer curtains of a Beverly Hills home, casting soft golden light across a marble kitchen floor that gleamed from endless polishing. On her knees, cloth in hand, Clara James scrubbed at a stubborn grease spot near the base of the oven. Her hands, once smooth and agile, were now swollen and stiff, the joints misshapen by decades of labor, but still they moved. Still they worked. 80 years old. 80. Most women her age were long retired, living quietly in senior communities or with family. But Clara didn't have that luxury. Retirement was a fantasy reserved for those who'd been paid fairly and often enough to save. She had no pension, no social security strong enough to live on, no savings to speak of. Just bills, arthritis, and a will to keep going. Her knees ached from the cold tile. She shifted slightly, gritting her teeth at the pain shooting up her leg. The client she worked for today, Mrs. Carmichael, wouldn't notice this little act of discomfort. Clara made sure of that. She had learned long ago that when you were old black and cleaning someone's home, invisibility was a form of protection. So she moved with quiet precision, the scent of lemon cleaner trailing behind her as she worked. The digital clock on the stainless steel stove blinked. 7:16 a.m. Still 5 hours to go before she could rest. Her uniform, pressed and spotless, clung to her back with perspiration, despite the air conditioning humming in the background. Every motion hurt now. Her hands throbbed, her back ached, her vision sometimes blurred. But she pushed on, fueled by necessity and something far older, a quiet pride. In the living room, the flat-screen television played morning news on low volume. Clara could hear fragments of the headlines as she moved between rooms, something about stock markets, celebrities, and political scandals. None of it meant anything to her world, not anymore. She paused briefly to massage her right hand, feeling the telltale heat of inflammation pulsing through her knuckles. Then she stood slowly, using the counter for balance. Her reflection in the glass of the microwave stared back at her, a thin woman with sharp cheekbones and eyes far too alert for someone her age. Her hair, neatly tied back into a bun, had gone entirely silver. Her expression was dignified, even regal, despite the exhaustion clinging to her bones. She moved to the sink and began scrubbing the dishes left from Mrs. Carmichael's dinner party the night before. Fine china, silver forks, crystal glasses. It reminded her of another house long ago, another sink, another child, a boy with quiet eyes and messy hair who liked to sit at the kitchen table while she worked, asking questions about the world, about people, about why things hurt and why some people were sad even when they smiled. Keanu. She hadn't spoken that name out loud in years, but it still echoed inside her, like the whisper of an old song. Keanu Reeves had been just 9 years old when she first met him, fragile in a way that wasn't physical. He had carried grief like it was sewn into his skin, though he never spoke of it. And she had understood, because she carried grief too. She'd been the housemaid in the Reeves household for nearly 6 years. Not just a cleaner, but a quiet presence in the background, making meals, folding laundry, listening more than speaking. She had a way with children. Maybe because she never tried to fix them. Maybe because she never tried to change who they were. She simply gave them space to feel safe. And for Keanu, that had mattered more than anyone realized. Clara remembered the first time he showed her his sketchbook. He'd been sitting on the kitchen floor, cross-legged, the pages resting against his knees. He was maybe 10. He looked up at her with a kind of nervous hope. "Do you think these are dumb?" he asked. She'd smiled gently, wiping her wet hands on her apron before crouching beside him. No, baby, I think those come from a very good place. His shoulders had relaxed. It had been the first time, she later realized, that someone had told him his ideas weren't ridiculous. She hadn't known then how far he would go, how bright his star would rise. But she knew this: the boy had heart, and that heart mattered. Now, decades later, she rinsed off a crystal wine glass and set it carefully on a towel. Her movements were slower than they used to be. Everything took longer. But she still did it with care, because that was the only way she knew. The truth was, Clara didn't have anyone waiting for her when she got home. No children, no spouse. Her sister, her only sibling, had passed years ago. Her neighbors were kind but busy. She rented a one-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of the city, the kind where water pressure was low and walls were thin, but she kept it spotless, just like everything else she touched. People thought of her as strong, and she was, but strength, she had learned, was often mistaken for invulnerability. People saw you keep going and assumed you had no choice but to be okay. They didn't see the quiet moments, the loneliness, the swelling in her knees that sometimes made it hard to stand, the cough that hadn't quite gone away, the nights she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, wondering what would happen if she couldn't work anymore. She turned off the faucet and wiped her hands. 8 houses a week. That's what it took to keep the lights on and groceries in the fridge. 8 different homes. 8 different families. Not one of them knew who she used to be to someone the world now adored. Not one of them knew she'd once held the hand of a boy who'd grow up to change Hollywood and had whispered to him, "You matter, baby," even when no one sees it. Clara limped slowly down the long marble hallway, her cleaning cart squeaking as one wheel protested every turn. The house she was in today, a 6-bedroom mansion perched in the Hollywood Hills, was one of her regulars. The young couple who owned it were nice enough, though they rarely said more than a passing "hey." To them, she was just the help, invisible, expected, like the light switch or the faucet. As she dusted a bookshelf lined with pristine hardcovers, she caught sight of a framed photo. A family vacation in Maui. Perfect smiles, wind in their hair. Clara paused for a moment, her cloth resting on the shelf. Not with envy. She didn't resent them. But a strange pang settled in her chest, like something forgotten had stirred awake. Once, years ago, she'd taken a trip with the Reeves family, just a short one, to Big Bear. Keanu had been maybe 12, shy and thoughtful. He'd gotten carsick halfway there. Clara had sat in the back with him, rubbing his back gently and holding a plastic bag just in case. That's what you did when you cared about someone. You held their hand when no one else did. She pushed the cart toward the next room, her hip aching with every step. She didn't complain, not when her employer texted her last-minute changes, not when she was asked to clean up after a late-night party that left champagne stains on the drapes. Clara had always taken pride in doing the work well, no matter how small or thankless. But lately, the thankless part was getting heavier. By the time she made it home that evening, the sun had dipped low behind the buildings, casting long shadows across the cracked sidewalk in front of her apartment complex. She climbed the steps one at a time, gripping the handrail like a lifeline. Inside, she dropped her keys into the chipped ceramic bowl near the door and sank into the old recliner by the window. Her bones throbbed, her wrists buzzed with nerve pain. But she didn't cry. Clara James didn't cry. Not even when the overdue electricity bill sat staring at her from the side table. She closed her eyes. Somewhere out there, Keanu Reeves, kind, generous, beloved Keanu, was living a life she had helped set in motion. She didn't expect him to remember her. But life, as she'd learned time and again, has a way of circling back when you least expect it. Clara James moved slowly through the tiny kitchen of her apartment, her hands wrapped around a chipped mug of warm tea. The air was heavy with silence, save for the faint buzz of a neighbor's television on the other side of the wall. Her back ached, and her knuckles throbbed with every movement, but she hardly noticed anymore. Pain had become the background hum of her days, woven into the rhythm of her breath. She sat down gently at the table, wincing as her knees locked into place. Her eyes lingered on a yellowed photograph tucked in the corner of a mirror. An old snapshot of a boy in a flannel shirt and shaggy hair, crouched beside her in the garden of the Reeves household. Keanu had been 7, maybe 8. Always barefoot, always asking questions that didn't sound like they belonged to a child. He'd asked her once if God made the stars, and when she'd answered, maybe he just gave us the eyes to see them, he'd thought about it in silence for 10 minutes. That had been Keanu's way, quiet thinking first, loud dreaming second. She had helped raise him from the time he was 5 to 15. She'd taught him how to scramble eggs, how to tie a tie before auditions, how to sit with grief when it came knocking. His mother worked long hours, often traveling, and Clara had been the one to listen to his first piano piece, to bandage his skinned knees, to slip him paperbacks about kindness and resilience when the world felt too harsh. But she had never asked for anything in return. That wasn't how she was raised. You gave what you could, you worked hard, and you stayed in the background. Love wasn't about what came back. It was about what you planted. Still, as she sat there that morning, she felt the crushing weight of time. 80 years old, cleaning strangers' homes. And now, with an envelope she couldn't bring herself to open resting on the counter, she feared the time had finally run out. "Grandma," Jasmine's voice came from the doorway, tentative and soft. Clara looked up, her granddaughter standing with a folded letter clutched in hand. "It's from the building office. Do you want me to read it?" Clara nodded slowly, bracing herself. Jasmine unfolded the paper and scanned the text, her face tightening. "It's an eviction notice. They're raising the rent again. You have 30 days. Clara closed her eyes. The tea in her hand trembled slightly. "I'll figure something out," she murmured. "But Grandma," Jasmine's voice cracked, "you're already working too much. You're not well. They can't just—" "They can," Clara said gently, touching her hand. "They always can." Across town, in a small corner booth at a cafe in Culver City, freelance journalist Lena Tran paused mid-sip of her coffee. At the table next to her, a young woman was speaking with concern, her voice low but urgent. She used to be Keanu Reeves's maid. Raised him, practically. And now she's getting evicted. Lena didn't mean to eavesdrop, but her ears perked. Keanu Reeves, raised by a maid? A story like that wasn't just interesting, it was personal, human, and possibly forgotten. Lena set down her coffee, pulled out her phone, and opened her notes. She had no idea where this thread might lead, but something told her it mattered. Lena Tran wasn't the type to chase gossip. Her work as a journalist focused on depth, on the stories that lived under headlines, the ones that clung to the edges of society, half buried under noise. But something about what she overheard tugged at her like a thread she couldn't ignore. Keanu Reeves, a maid, eviction. The quiet tension in that girl's voice said everything. This wasn't just a story. This was someone's life unraveling. She stood, paid for her drink, and walked to the counter where the girl now stood waiting for her own order. "Excuse me," Lena said gently. "I couldn't help overhearing. I'm a journalist. My name's Lena Tran. That story about your grandmother. Did you mean Keanu Reeves, the actor?" The girl looked surprised, cautious. "Why?" "Because if she helped raise someone who became a household name and she's now being evicted, I think people might care. And maybe someone, especially him, should know." The girl hesitated, then nodded slowly. "My grandma's name is Clara James. She worked for his family back in Toronto. She never talks about it unless you really ask. She doesn't want people thinking she's chasing something. But she's tired, and I'm scared for her." Lena's journalist instincts lit up, but she forced herself to speak softly, earn trust. "I'd like to meet her, not to exploit, just to listen. If she's willing." Jasmine studied her for a moment, then pulled out her phone. "Okay, but don't make her feel small. She's been through too much for that." Back in her apartment, Clara sat on the edge of her bed, staring at her worn shoes. She had just finished polishing them with the last of her old tin of saddle soap. They were cracked in the soles, but still presentable. She had always believed in presenting dignity, no matter the paycheck. Her mother had taught her that. "Don't let this world make you invisible," she used to say. "They'll try, but you hold your chin up, even if your feet are sore." The knock on the door startled her. Jasmine peeked inside. "Grandma, this is Lena. She's a journalist. She wants to talk to you." Clara frowned slightly, caught between suspicion and exhaustion. "Journalists don't come looking for old maids like me." "I think your story matters," Lena said gently, "and I think people need to hear it." Clara didn't speak for a long moment. Then she nodded slowly. "All right, but you better come in now. I only have enough energy to tell it once." Lena stepped into the small apartment and took a seat. And Clara, still in her work clothes, began to speak, not for fame, not for favors, but for the memory of a barefoot boy who once looked up at the stars and asked her if dreams could fly. Clara spoke slowly at first, her voice raspy but sure. "He was different from the start, you know. Keanu, that boy had a softness in him, not weak, just quiet, gentle. He'd sit on the floor and read for hours while other kids made noise. He didn't mind being alone. Sometimes, I think he preferred it." Lena listened without interruption, scribbling only what she needed to remember. Jasmine sat on the arm of the couch, watching her grandmother with pride and concern. His mama was working 2 jobs. His dad, Clara paused, her mouth tightening. "Well, he wasn't always around, so when Keanu got home from school, I was usually the one there. I'd fix him peanut butter toast and we'd sit in the kitchen while he talked about outer space or samurai movies." She chuckled softly, shaking her head. "He once asked me if you could build a rocket out of milk cartons. I said, 'Baby, if anyone could, it'd be you.'" Lena leaned forward. "Did you stay close after he grew up?" "No," Clara said, her tone even. "He left Toronto for Hollywood. I stayed behind. People like me, we don't follow. We're the ones left behind to clean up the memories." "And he never reached out?" Clara looked out the window. "I never expected him to. That boy had a big life ahead of him. I was just part of the foundation." She hesitated before adding, "But sometimes, late at night, I wonder if he remembers the nights I sat by his bed when he had the flu, or how I taught him to fold his laundry. The small things that make a life feel safe." Lena nodded, her voice soft. "Would you want him to know now?" Clara didn't answer immediately. Then she whispered, "Not for me, but for Jasmine. So she can see that even quiet kindness leaves a mark. That doing good, being good, matters, even if no one claps for you." Lena gently placed her notebook on the table. "Thank you. I don't know where this will lead, but I promise to handle it with care." As Lena stood to leave, she passed the eviction notice still pinned to the fridge. Her eyes paused on the date. Barely 2 weeks left. Outside, she took a breath, heart pounding. This was more than a profile. It was a reckoning. A reminder that behind every success was someone who made dinner, folded shirts, and whispered encouragement into ears that, one day, changed the world. And now, the world needed to hear her name. Lena Tran didn't expect the story to keep her awake at night. She'd covered breaking news, corruption scandals, even international tragedies. But something about Clara James, the soft-spoken maid in Los Angeles, clung to her like fog that wouldn't lift. She sat at her laptop in her small apartment near Koreatown, the cursor blinking on a blank document, a few quotes jotted down in her notebook, a single photo of Clara, face worn but kind, her hand resting gently on the shoulder of a teenage girl Lena assumed was her granddaughter, Jasmine. But it wasn't the image that haunted her. It was what Clara had said when she thought no one was listening. "Keanu used to stare at the stars like they were talking to him. I'd clean the kitchen and he'd sit cross-legged on the floor, asking me why the moon followed us home at night." Lena had scribbled it down without knowing why. She'd only stopped in that cafe by accident. Her interview subject had canceled and she'd needed coffee. Clara had been at the counter, quietly chatting with the barista, her work uniform creased and her voice tired. The barista had asked how long she'd been working. "Since I was 14, Clara had said. "I once worked for the Reeves family. I helped raise that boy like he was my own." Lena's ears had perked. She'd turned, taken a seat near them, pretending to scroll her phone while Clara shared quiet memories between sips of weak tea. It wasn't boastful. It wasn't even meant to be heard. Just a woman reminiscing. But as a journalist, Lena knew gold when she heard it. Now, hours later, the weight of those words pressed on her chest. She didn't want to write a puff piece. She didn't care for clickbait about Keanu's secret nanny. This was different. This was a woman who had lived her life in the margins, serving quietly, forgotten until the light happened to fall on her again. Lena clicked open a new document and typed the title. The Woman Who Helped Raise a Star. She spent the next 10 hours writing. It wasn't just about Clara's job or her connection to Keanu Reeves. It was about what it meant to be invisible for so long, and to still carry love for someone who may have long forgotten you. She described Clara's aching knees, the eviction notice taped to her fridge, the black and white photo of a boy on her nightstand. She included snippets of Jasmine's concern, her gentle rebukes. "Grandma, you shouldn't still be doing this." Lena weaved in quiet memories of a young Keanu, curious and kind, with eyes like open windows to a world he hadn't yet built. By sunrise, she was done. The story was raw. It was honest. It was not what she usually pitched. But something told her this one needed to be told exactly like this. She hit submit. Lena didn't expect the story to explode. By noon, her editor had called her 3 times. "It's going everywhere," he'd said, breathless. "Lena, I'm getting calls from the Times, the Post, even Variety. They all want to reprint it. What did you tap into?" She didn't know how to answer. It wasn't written to go viral. It wasn't clever. It wasn't designed for shock value. It was just the truth. Unpolished and tender. By evening, the headline had trended on Twitter. The Woman Who Helped Raise a Star. The photo of Clara, standing outside a modest home in her janitor uniform, had been shared over 1 million times. Some users posted side-by-side pictures, Clara at 80 and a still of Keanu Reeves from one of his movies, eyes skyward. The contrast said it all. Comments flooded in. "I'm sobbing. This woman is a treasure. Someone please, help her. She raised one of the kindest men in Hollywood, and now she's facing eviction? Heartbreaking. Keanu, if you see this, do something." The internet can be cruel, but sometimes, when the story is right, it rises to the occasion. Lena watched it all in silence, still in her apartment, curled up in the same sweatshirt from last night. She didn't refresh the page. She didn't celebrate. She just hoped Clara wouldn't be overwhelmed. Her contact info had been kept private, but the digital world had its ways. Meanwhile, across Los Angeles, the story reached an entirely different set of eyes. Claire Jones was Keanu Reeves's longtime personal assistant, more like a quiet guardian of the fortress that was his privacy. When she saw Lena's story, she didn't call Keanu right away. She printed it. She walked into his kitchen the next morning, where Keanu stood barefoot, feeding his dog. She didn't speak. She just slid the pages across the counter, face down. Keanu looked at her, puzzled, then flipped the first page. He read silently for several minutes. His hand froze halfway to his coffee. Claire didn't interrupt. His lips parted slightly, his brow furrowed. Then he put the pages down. Very carefully. He didn't speak for a long while. Claire watched his expression. Soft, pained, somewhere between nostalgia and guilt. Finally, he said, "She's still alive?" Claire nodded. "We confirmed this morning." He was quiet again. Then, a whisper. "We owe her." Claire didn't ask who he meant by we. She didn't have to. He rubbed his eyes and reached for the article again, this time slower, tracing the lines with his finger. "I thought she moved away," I thought. I didn't know. He shook his head, and a long silence filled the kitchen. Not a silence of indecision, but of planning. Claire stepped out of the room and closed the door softly behind her. That afternoon, Keanu canceled his meetings. No explanations. His manager was confused, his agent annoyed, but Keanu didn't waver. He spent the rest of the day in his home office, going through old boxes, flipping through childhood photos, searching for something he hadn't allowed himself to touch in years. A scrap of cloth, a note written in cursive, an old photo of him and Clara sitting on the front steps of his childhood home. He was maybe 10. She looked tired even then, but she was smiling. She always smiled when he needed it most. He ran his hand across the photograph, thumb pausing over her face. "Clara," he murmured. That night, Claire returned. She found Keanu still at his desk, eyes red, voice low. "She never asked for anything," he said. "Not even once. She just loved." Claire nodded, setting a folder on the desk. "Here's what we found so far. The eviction notice is real. She's been working 6 days a week. Her granddaughter's caring for her now, but they're barely hanging on." Keanu stared at the folder, unmoving. Then, finally, "No more." He stood, straightened his back. "Tomorrow, I want everything ready, quietly, no press, no announcements. This isn't about publicity." Claire asked gently, "What is it about?" Keanu looked at her, eyes deep with something both fierce and tender. "Gratitude." He stepped away from the desk. "We're not going to just write a check." He turned to the window, the city stretching out beneath the twilight sky. "We're going to make it right." The knock came just after sunrise. Clara James, still wearing the same tattered robe she'd had for nearly a decade, shuffled to the door of her small apartment in South Central Los Angeles. She wasn't expecting anyone. Jasmine had already left for her shift at the nursing home, and the landlord had given up on being polite with notices. Her joints ached more than usual that morning, a dull warning in her knees and fingers that rain might be coming. She opened the door slowly, the chain still on, just enough to see a well-dressed woman standing in the hallway. "Mrs. James?" the woman asked, her voice calm but warm. "I'm Claire Hamilton. I work with Mr. Reeves." Clara blinked. "Reeves?" "Keanu Reeves," Claire said. "May I come in for just a moment? I have something for you. No press, no cameras, just a message." Clara's first instinct was suspicion. She'd been burned too many times by people offering handouts with strings attached. But there was something sincere in the woman's face. Her eyes didn't dart around, didn't look rehearsed. Claire wasn't dressed like a social worker or a journalist. She looked like someone who took their job seriously but left ego at the door. Clara undid the chain slowly and opened the door. Claire stepped inside and extended a sealed envelope. "He asked me to give this to you personally." Clara took it carefully, her hands still trembling slightly from arthritis and nerves. She walked over to the small kitchen table and sat down before opening the envelope. Inside was a short, handwritten letter. "Clara, you may not remember all the things you did for me, but I remember them. I remember the way you listened when no one else did, the way you let me dream out loud. You never laughed when I told you I'd be somebody. You were there when I was just a boy with nothing but questions. You gave me kindness when it cost you energy. You gave me peace when the house wasn't peaceful. I know you didn't do it for thanks, but you deserve one, a real one. There's no press, no headlines, just an offer if you're willing. With love and respect, Keanu." Clara stared at the letter for a long time, her throat tight. She hadn't seen Keanu since he was a teenager. He'd vanished into Hollywood, into a world far away from the one she lived in, where gas bills and eviction notices dictated every breath. Claire sat quietly, giving her space. "I don't understand," Clara finally said, her voice breaking. "Why now?" "Read the article," Claire said gently. He didn't want attention, he just wanted to help. "The apartment is already arranged. Quiet neighborhood, ground floor, no stairs, paid in full. If you'd like to see it, we can go now." Clara hesitated. Her pride was old and worn thin like her sweater, but there was something about the way the letter was written. No pity, no saving, just remembering. She reached for her coat. "Let's go." The ride to the new apartment was quiet. Clara sat in the back seat of Claire's car, Jasmine holding her hand. Outside the window, Los Angeles blurred by. Strip malls, traffic lights, corner stores where Clara used to buy bread and aspirin. Her hands were folded in her lap, the letter still clutched like a life preserver. She didn't say much on the way. Jasmine watched her carefully, knowing better than to push. Clara's eyes were locked forward, blinking back a mix of emotions too thick to name. They pulled up to a quiet street shaded by palm trees. The building was modest from the outside, cream stucco with pale blue shutters, but it had a warmth to it. Not showy, not flashy, just clean, safe, like someone had thought about what it should feel like, not just what it should cost. Claire led them through a secure gate, up a short path lined with lavender plants. She stopped at apartment 1C. "Here we are." She unlocked the door, stepping aside to let Clara enter first. The scent hit her before the view did. It was subtle, familiar, lemon balm and vanilla, the kind of fragrance Clara used to put in her cleaning water when she was younger. Then came the sight of it. The apartment was beautiful. Sunlight streamed through tall windows onto polished wooden floors. A cream couch with blue throw pillows sat across from a small bookshelf, already filled with titles she used to borrow from the public library. A kettle was already on the stovetop. On the table sat a tin of her favorite tea, one she hadn't tasted in years because it was too expensive. Jasmine stepped in behind her, her mouth falling open. "Grandma." Clara walked slowly to the living room, her hand grazing the soft back of the couch, then moving to the edge of a quilt draped across a rocking chair. She picked it up and held it. The stitching was familiar. "My mother made one just like this," she whispered. Claire nodded. "We did our homework." He remembered the details. Clara turned to her, eyes glassy. This is mine? All of it?" Claire's smile was gentle. "Yes, it's yours. Fully paid for. No rent. No utilities. Groceries will be delivered weekly. There's a community nurse on call 24/7, and Jasmine is always welcome to stay. He made sure of that." Clara sat down slowly on the couch as if she was afraid it might vanish. Her shoulders shook once, then again. Jasmine knelt beside her, wrapping her arms around her grandmother's waist. For the first time in years, Clara James cried. Not from pain, not from exhaustion, but from something else, something rare and overwhelming. Relief. "Why would he do this?" she finally asked through tears. Claire sat across from her. "Because you mattered. You mattered then and you still matter now. And sometimes people just need to be reminded of that." Clara looked down at the quilt in her hands. "I didn't teach him much. I just made sure he had a clean shirt and a warm meal." "You gave him steadiness," Claire said. "You gave him dignity when no one else saw the quiet boy in the corner." Clara closed her eyes. "And now, he sees me." Claire nodded. As Jasmine explored the small kitchen with awe, Clara sat back against the couch, letting the silence of peace settle around her. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel like she had to rush anywhere. Didn't feel like she had to apologize for breathing, for needing, for growing old. The apartment wasn't just a gift. It was an answer to a question she never dared to ask. Was I ever seen? The answer now, as clear as the sunlight on her hands, was yes. The sunlight filtered through soft linen curtains, casting gentle patterns across the living room floor. Clara stood in the entryway, hesitant, her hand still wrapped around the strap of her worn purse. Claire had stepped aside, giving her space, not rushing her. This wasn't just an apartment. It was something else, something that reached back across time. The air smelled faintly of jasmine and old wood polish, like the homes Clara used to clean in her younger days. She blinked several times as her eyes adjusted to the light, trying to process what she was seeing. The apartment was modest, yes, but elegant in a way that felt curated for comfort, not show. There was a warmth here, an intentionality in every detail. Claire stepped forward quietly. "Take your time." Clara's eyes were drawn to a low table beneath the front window. A woven runner lay across it. Same color, same pattern as the one she used to own decades ago, before it had worn thin and frayed. She reached out slowly, brushing her fingers across the fabric, almost expecting it to crumble into dust. It didn't. Then her eyes landed on a photograph propped delicately against a ceramic lamp. Clara froze. It was a black and white picture, slightly faded, of her and a young boy. She was in her 20s then, smiling softly, standing in a sunlit backyard. The boy was maybe 9, gangly and bright-eyed. He was holding a toy lightsaber made out of sticks and duct tape, and she had one hand gently placed on his shoulder. Clara's mouth opened, but no sound came. Her knees buckled slightly, and she reached for the edge of the nearby armchair for support. Her eyes didn't leave the photo. "I thought that was long gone," she whispered. Claire nodded. "He kept it, all these years." Clara sank slowly into the chair, heart hammering. The upholstery was soft, too soft for anything from a second-hand shop. The armrest bore the tiniest fray in the corner. "This is my chair," she murmured. "I used to sit in this." Back when he'd come home from school and talk about movie scripts he wanted to write? Claire gave her a small smile. "He told us it was your favorite. We tracked down the exact model from an old catalog, had it reupholstered, same pattern, same fabric." Clara felt the tears rising before she could stop them. "Why?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Why would he remember all this?" Claire knelt gently in front of her. "Because you weren't just a maid to him. You were home. You were safety. You were the one person who never told him his dreams were too big." Clara stared at the photo again, hand pressed to her lips. In all her years, she'd never imagined something like this. Clara rose slowly from the chair, walking deeper into the apartment. Her footsteps were soft against the polished wood floors. Every few feet she stopped, startled by some small detail that yanked at the threads of her memory. In the kitchen, a tin of rooibos tea sat on the counter. Not just any tea, her favorite South African blend, the one she hadn't tasted in over a decade. She reached for it instinctively, her fingers trembling. The label was in the old style, before the company had rebranded. This was a vintage tin. Someone had gone through the trouble to find it. "I used to drink this at night," she whispered, almost to herself. "When the house was finally quiet, I'd make a cup and sit outside, listening to the crickets and thinking about my mama." Claire nodded gently behind her. He remembered that. Clara turned toward the stove. A cast-iron skillet hung neatly from a hook on the wall, identical to the one she used to cook in. The apron, folded neatly over the oven handle, had a faded floral pattern. Her pattern. And there, taped to the fridge, was a childish drawing. Her in a blue dress, standing beside a tall boy with spiky hair, under a cartoon sun. She blinked hard. "I thought I threw this away," she murmured. "You almost did," Claire said. "But Keanu pulled it from the trash when he was 10. He kept it. Still has the original. This is a copy." Clara gripped the fridge handle to steady herself. The world felt off balance, like someone had tipped the past and poured it gently into the present. In the hallway, soft light spilled from a room at the end. As Clara stepped in, her breath caught. A quilt lay across the bed, hand-stitched with worn fabric patches in a rainbow of colors. Some were faded, others still vibrant. It wasn't the exact quilt, but the design was unmistakable. She had sewn it herself over the course of 2 winters while watching over young Keanu during flu seasons and stormy nights. "I left this behind when I moved to Baldwin Hills," she said, voice catching. Claire stepped beside her. He commissioned an artist to recreate it from memory, said it made him feel safe as a boy. Clara touched one of the patches, bright yellow with tiny white stars. He used to hide his comic books under here, she said with a soft laugh. Thought I didn't know. I let him keep them there. Claire didn't speak. She didn't need to. Clara sat on the edge of the bed, her hands resting in her lap, the weight of it all pressing gently down on her shoulders. Not heavy like burden, but like reverence, like the feeling of being seen. And for the first time in decades, she did feel seen. Not as someone who scrubbed floors or folded laundry, but as someone who mattered. As someone who had been remembered. She rose again, slowly, drawn now to a small shelf above the dresser. On it stood a wooden frame, not ornate or fancy, but smooth with age. Clara leaned in. Her heart seemed to skip a beat. Inside the frame was a photo, slightly faded at the edges, of her and Keanu. He must have been 8 or 9, perched on a wooden fence behind the garden at his childhood home. She stood next to him, one arm gently resting behind his back. He was mid-laugh. She had forgotten the photo existed. How? She whispered, fingertips brushing the glass. Claire walked to her side. He found it when going through old storage boxes. He said you were one of the few people who ever made him feel safe. Clara didn't answer. Her throat was too tight. Her knees weakened again, but this time she didn't sit. She stood firm, holding on to the moment, anchoring herself in it. Why didn't he come himself? She finally asked, her voice just above a whisper. Claire looked toward the window. Because he didn't want to turn this into a performance. No cameras, no headlines. He said, this wasn't for the world, it was for you. Clara turned away from the frame, blinking rapidly. Her chest rose and fell in shallow waves. So he really remembers. He remembers everything, Claire said. The songs you hummed when folding his laundry, the stories you told him about the stars, the way you stayed late the night his mother forgot he had the flu. Clara closed her eyes, and for a moment, the years vanished. She could feel the breeze through the screen door, hear the scratch of a pencil as Keanu drew comic book sketches at the table. She remembered his quiet questions, the way he asked about the universe and how she'd done her best to answer with the little she knew, because no one else did. When she opened her eyes, they were shimmering, but her voice was strong. Then tell him I remember too. Claire smiled gently. I'll tell him. Clara took one last look around the apartment. Not just an act of kindness, not charity. This was a map of memory, a home stitched together by someone who hadn't just remembered, but honored her. And for the first time in a long, long time, Clara James began to believe something she'd almost forgotten. She had mattered. She still did. And someone, somewhere, had never stopped carrying her story. Clara had barely been in her new home a week when the whispers began. It started small, sideways glances in the grocery store, an awkward pause from a neighbor in the apartment hallway, even a subtle shift in tone when an old acquaintance called to check in. There was a pattern in their eyes, a flicker of disbelief, followed by suspicion. Someone had seen her step out of a black town car at the new building. Someone else recognized her from the viral article Lena had written weeks earlier. Whispers turned into rumors. People wanted to know how a housekeeper who had once borrowed sugar from neighbors now lived in a luxury senior complex in the hills of Pasadena. One afternoon, while folding laundry in her small, sunlit bedroom, Clara heard her phone buzz. It was a message from Teresa, a former employer from years ago who had once let Clara go without so much as a goodbye. The message was as sugary as it was sharp. Saw the article. Good for you, I guess. Hope it's not some scam. Be careful. Clara stared at the screen, her hands trembling slightly, not from fear, she had lived through worse, but from the sting of being doubted. Again. She sat on the edge of her bed, feeling the soft thread of the quilt Claire had told her was custom-stitched to match the one Clara had as a girl. The new apartment was quiet, but the noise outside was getting louder. Whispers about why someone like her would get a place like this, why Keanu Reeves, of all people, would get involved. Some said it was fake. Others claimed it had to be a publicity stunt. No one could believe a woman who cleaned floors for a living could matter so much to someone the world saw as untouchable. But one afternoon, the past came knocking again, this time gently. It was Lena Tran. Clara opened the door to find the journalist standing outside with a coffee in one hand and a notebook tucked under her arm. "I'm not here for a story," Lena said quickly, sensing Clara's hesitation. "I just couldn't stop thinking about you. May I come in?" Clara hesitated, then nodded. As they sat at the kitchen table, Lena looked around, her eyes scanning the shelves. The room was warm, sunlit, filled with small tokens of Clara's life. Old books, a vase of fresh flowers, the framed photo of Miles and Jasmine. But Lena's gaze landed on the small photo tucked quietly beside the tea cabinet. A younger Clara smiling beside a boy with soft brown eyes and shaggy hair. Lena's voice dropped to a whisper. "It really is him." Clara said nothing, just stared down at her cup. Clara took a slow sip of her tea, letting the quiet settle. The weight of Lena's question hung in the air, heavy but gentle. "Was just a boy," Clara finally said, eyes fixed on the photo. "Quiet, kind, curious in a way that never made you tired. You'd find him on the floor with wires and cardboard, building something, always thinking." Lena waited, pen untouched. This moment wasn't for reporting, it was for understanding. "I didn't think he'd remember me," Clara said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Most people don't. You clean their homes, you pick up after their children, and eventually you fade into the corners of their memory, if you were ever in it to begin with." "But he did remember," Lena said gently. Clara's fingers curled around the warm cup. "Apparently so." Lena leaned back slightly. "I know this is personal, and I respect that, but people are talking. There's speculation online, people saying you're making it up, that the article was just emotional bait." Clara blinked slowly. Her voice remained steady. "Let them talk. They want a headline," she continued, "but what I have here," she looked around the apartment, motioning toward the tea canister, the quilt, the telescope on the patio. "This isn't for show. It's too quiet, too kind." Lena's eyes softened. "Do you think he'll speak publicly?" Clara shook her head. "He doesn't want the noise. He never did. And honestly, neither do I." For a moment they both sat in silence. The wind rustled through the small garden outside. The air smelled faintly of jasmine. Bowls fell. "How didn't send anyone from a PR team," Clara added. "No interviews, no fanfare, just a letter, and Claire?" Lena's eyebrows lifted. "His assistant?" Clara nodded. She came with the offer. Quiet, respectful, she said, "He just wants you to be okay." That was all. "And you didn't question it?" Clara smiled faintly. "Of course I did. I've lived long enough to know nothing comes free." But there was something in her eyes. She knew too much. Small things, like my favorite tea, the color of the curtains I used to have in my bedroom when I worked in the Reeves household. That kind of knowing doesn't come from research. That comes from remembering. Lena nodded slowly, her journalist's mind piecing together the human truth. "He didn't just help you. He saw you." Clara looked down. "I think maybe he always did, even when he was little." Then she added almost like a prayer, "But why now?" It was then that Claire entered quietly from the hallway, having arrived unnoticed. She set down a paper bag of groceries and answered, calm and steady, "Because it's never too late to say thank you." Lena turned toward Claire, surprised by her entrance, but Clara just gave a knowing smile. She had learned by now that Claire had a way of appearing exactly when she was needed. Claire stepped further into the room, setting down a carton of eggs and a bundle of fresh herbs on the counter before joining them at the table. "Keanu doesn't do anything halfway," she said. "When he realized where you were, what you were facing, he said just one thing to me: we owe her." Clara's throat tightened. Her hands curled into her lap, fingers nervously twisting the edge of the tablecloth. "He doesn't owe me anything." Claire looked at her with such sincerity that it made Clara pause. Maybe not in dollars or deeds, but in memory, in spirit. You showed him kindness when it cost you everything. Your energy, your time, your heart. And he never forgot that. Lena leaned forward slightly, moved by the moment. I think the world is just hungry for that kind of story. Quiet loyalty, gentle remembrance. Clara glanced at her. Then maybe the world should learn to stop expecting noise. Not every thank you needs a headline. Claire nodded in agreement. That's exactly what he believes. This was never about a press release. That's why there were no statements, no photo ops, just help. Quiet, honest help. Still, the whispers outside Clara's apartment continued to stir. A former employer down the street told anyone who'd listen that Clara must have lied to get charity. A man she barely knew knocked on her door and asked if she'd won the lottery. Even the building's manager had once offhandedly joked, "You must have saved a king in a past life." Clara kept her head high. Her dignity had been earned the hard way, through decades of invisible labor, not through a moment of pity. That night, after Lena and Claire left, Clara stood at her bedroom window, looking out at the city lights below. Somewhere in those flickering dots were people who would never know her name, never care about the quiet years she gave to the world. But one of them remembered, and maybe that was enough. She turned back toward the photo of young Keanu, nestled beside her framed picture of Jasmine and Miles. Her hands ached from arthritis, and her knees still stiffened when she moved, but in that moment, her heart felt light. Outside, the wind carried the scent of blooming jasmine through the open patio doors. And somewhere, not too far away, whispers faded into silence. Clara wasn't expecting anyone that morning. She had just finished steeping a fresh pot of chamomile tea, her favorite blend, the one Claire had stocked in the cupboard when she first moved in. The sun streamed through the wide kitchen window, warming the countertop and lighting up the soft green tiles. There was a peace in this house she had never known in her adult life, a kind of stillness that made her feel safe. She had just settled into her favorite armchair, a thick blue cushion pressed to her lower back for support, when a soft knock echoed at the door. Not Jasmine, she always called before coming. Not Claire. She was out of town this weekend attending a quiet arts event with her daughter. For a brief moment, Clara hesitated, her hands resting lightly on the arms of the chair. Then, she pushed herself up, slowly but steadily. The knock came again, gentle, respectful. She opened the door. There he was, Keanu Reeves. Older, quieter, his hair flecked with gray at the temples, eyes as gentle and deep as she remembered. He wore a simple black jacket, jeans, and a plain gray t-shirt. No entourage, no cameras, just him. Clara blinked, then smiled softly. "You came," she said. "I had to," he replied, his voice low. They stood there a second, just breathing in the weight of the years between them. Keanu stepped in slowly, glancing around the room as though stepping back into a dream. His eyes lingered on the framed photo on the entry table, an old snapshot of her holding a squirming 6-year-old Keanu in her lap, both of them laughing. He exhaled. "It looks like home," he said, almost to himself. Clara closed the door behind him. "Sit down, baby. I made some tea." He followed her to the kitchen, every step filled with reverence. The kitchen hadn't changed since Claire and the designers had brought it to life. The same clean tile, the same soft lighting. But somehow, with Keanu there, it felt even more real, like time had folded in on itself and brought back something sacred. Clara poured 2 cups, hands steady despite the quiet tremble in her chest. She handed him one. He took it gently. "You still put cinnamon in your chamomile," he said, smiling faintly. She chuckled. "You used to say it made it taste like cookies, so I kept doing it." They sat down at the kitchen table. He leaned forward, resting his arms on the smooth surface. She noticed how his hands hadn't changed, still long fingers, still calloused, in a way that suggested he hadn't grown soft with time, just seasoned. "I've been meaning to do this for a long time," he said softly. Clara looked at him, her smile fading into something more serious. "I never needed anything from you, Keanu. You know that." "I know," he nodded. "That's why I'm here." Keanu leaned back in the chair, his gaze wandering around the room like he was rediscovering something sacred. There was nothing extravagant about Clara's home, just warmth. It smelled faintly of lavender and old wood polish. On the windowsill, a pot of African violets bloomed gently in the afternoon light. Clara had kept those alive, with the same tender consistency she once gave to the little boy in her care. "You know," she said gently, "when you were little, you used to talk to the flowers." Keanu looked up, slightly amused. "I did?" She nodded. "Used to whisper to them like they were going to whisper back." He smiled with a soft laugh. "I guess I always hoped something would—" Clara tilted her head. "You've always had that kind of heart. People don't always see it, but I always did." The quiet between them wasn't awkward. It was full, saturated with memories neither needed to explain. Keanu's fingers traced the rim of his teacup absently. His voice softened. "Sometimes, I think everything good I ever believed about myself came from this kitchen." She blinked. "Oh, Keanu." He shook his head, eyes serious. "You showed me what gentleness looks like. When the world was loud, you were quiet, but you made more sense than anyone else." Clara looked down, touched beyond words. There was a rawness to the moment, a humility that came from being truly seen. Keanu reached into his jacket pocket and slid something across the table. It was a photograph. Faded, creased, clearly old, but unmistakable. Clara, 30 years younger, arms wrapped protectively around a boy with tangled hair and wide, wondering eyes. He was holding a paper rocket, beaming. "I kept it," Keanu said, "through every movie, every country. Every time I felt lost, I looked at this." Her hand trembled as she picked it up. "Lord, I remember this. You were always building things, always dreaming. You were the one who made me believe dreams were allowed." There it was again, that quiet gratitude, never flashy, never performative, just truth, plain and rooted deep. Clara chuckled as she brushed her thumb over the image. "Your hair was a mess back then." Keanu grinned. "Still kind of is." "Oh, child." It was like a bird tried to nest in it. They both laughed, a real belly-deep laugh that left tears on the edges of their eyes. The photo stayed between them on the table, a relic and a reminder. And for a little while longer they just sat, letting time fade. Two souls tied by memory, sitting in the kitchen where love had once lived quietly and now echoed louder than ever. Clara poured them both another cup of tea, her hands a little steadier now, as if the presence of Keanu had calmed something deeper than her nerves, something in her bones that had carried too much weight for too long. He looked around once more, then his eyes settled on a worn book resting on the counter. A Wrinkle in Time, the same copy she'd read to him as a child. "You still have this?" he asked, reaching for it. Clara smiled. "Page 84 still got peanut butter fingerprints from when you insisted books should be read with snacks." He chuckled. "I was sure the story needed fuel." He turned the pages carefully. It smelled like memory, like long afternoons when the only sound was her voice and the wind outside. Clara had given him a world inside that small house, a sanctuary where curiosity wasn't weird, and kindness wasn't weakness. Then came the silence again, the kind you don't interrupt with small talk. Keanu looked down, his voice almost a whisper. "Clara, I wish I'd come sooner." She reached across the table and put her hand gently over his. "You came when it mattered." He looked up. Their eyes met. "You were the one who saw me," he said. "And now," she replied softly, "I get to see you, the man you became." Outside the window, the sunlight had begun to soften, slipping into the gold of early evening, the kind of light that seems to forgive everything. Clara sat back with a sigh, not of weariness, but release. "I never needed thanks, Keanu, just to know you lived well, that you kept your heart." He nodded. "I did. Because of you." There were no reporters, no press releases, no camera flashes, just two people in a modest kitchen where a boy once learned that love wasn't loud, it was steady, present, patient, like the hands that had made him sandwiches after school, tucked him in during thunder, and quietly slipped extra money into his worn coat pockets when he left home for the first time. Keanu stood to leave but paused at the doorway. He looked back at her, silhouetted by the light that poured in behind her. "I'll be back," he said. Clara nodded. "I'll be here." He smiled, tired, full, grateful, then turned and stepped outside, into a world that now knew what he had always known. That before the fame, before the movies, before the legend, there was a woman with tired hands and a quiet heart who believed in a little boy and never stopped. Clara sipped the chilled, sparkling cider in her glass, feeling it fizz gently against her lips. Across the table, Keanu was listening intently to Mr. Taylor as he recounted a memory from years ago, the day young Keanu had stayed after music class just to help polish the piano keys. He liked how the light reflected off the ivory when it was clean, Mr. Taylor said, smiling. Said it made the notes feel crisper. Clara chuckled softly. He always did pay attention to things no one else noticed. "Still does," Claire said from the other side of the table, raising her glass slightly toward Clara. "Especially the people who shaped him." Jasmine leaned in. "Did you ever think you'd be sitting here like this, Grandma?" Clara looked at her granddaughter. Her eyes shimmered under the soft chandelier light. "No, I never thought I'd see a day like this, but I'm grateful." As dessert was served, warm apple pie and hand-whipped cream, Keanu stood but didn't raise his voice or tap his glass. He simply placed a hand gently on the back of Clara's chair. The room quieted on its own. He didn't make a speech. There were no grand declarations, just a simple sentence, spoken with the quiet weight of memory. "Each of you made it okay for a boy like me to be different." He looked around the table, his gaze lingering on each guest for a beat longer than expected. "You might not have thought it was much back then, but for me, it meant everything." Then he sat back down, as if that was all he needed to say. Clara felt Jasmine's hand reach for hers under the table. They held on. The dinner continued with laughter and soft conversations. Stories flowed from every corner, recollections of small, forgotten kindnesses that had left deep marks, like the time Mrs. Alvarez had held back a book that Keanu desperately wanted to read, keeping it hidden behind the desk until he could make it in after school. Or how Mr. Taylor had taught him how to listen to silence between notes, not just the notes themselves. What struck Clara most was that none of these people had been rich. None had held powerful jobs or run large institutions. Yet each had left a fingerprint on a future none of them could have imagined. As coffee was poured and candles flickered low, Keanu rose one last time, this time holding a small wooden box. He passed it to Clara quietly. Inside was a photograph, faded, soft-edged with time. It showed a much younger Clara, arms crossed, standing in the backyard of the Reeves home. Keanu, maybe 9 or 10, sat at her feet, holding a comic book, grinning. On the back of the photo was a single sentence, written in Keanu's handwriting. "Thank you for giving me a safe place to dream." Clara pressed the photo to her chest. She didn't cry. Not because she wasn't moved, but because the moment didn't call for tears. It called for reverence and stillness, and the quiet knowing that somehow, despite all the years, everything had come full circle. As the evening ended and the guests hugged goodbye beneath the stars, Clara stood beside Keanu in the quiet of the garden. "You remembered it all," she said. Keanu looked at her, voice gentle. "Some things, some people, you don't forget." And for once, Clara let herself believe it. The morning sunlight streamed softly through Clara's new curtains as she poured herself a cup of tea, the same cinnamon blend she once brewed for a shy little boy with tousled hair and quiet eyes. Jasmine had already left for work and the apartment was silent, except for the occasional chirp of birds outside. Peace had become a familiar guest now, but something inside Clara stirred. Not restlessness, something else, a sense of readiness. That same afternoon, a familiar knock came at the door. When Clara opened it, she found Lena Tran standing on the welcome mat, holding a small notebook and a gentle smile. "I was in the neighborhood," Lena said, though Clara knew it wasn't coincidence. "May I come in?" Clara nodded, stepping aside to let the young journalist in. Lena's eyes scanned the space, the soft furniture, the neatly arranged bookshelf with old novels and new memories. She didn't mention the telescope by the window, or the framed photo of a younger Keanu smiling beside a beaming teenage Jasmine. Instead, she looked directly at Clara. "I want to tell your story, the real one, but only if you're ready, and only if it's your voice." Clara didn't answer right away. She sat down slowly, her hands curling around her tea mug. For years, she had cleaned other people's homes, held other people's babies, listened to other people's secrets, and remained invisible. But now, she was being offered something far more sacred than recognition: agency. "I'll do it," she said finally, her voice steady. "But on my terms." Lena nodded. "Absolutely." Clara leaned forward. "This story isn't about celebrity. It's not about Keanu. It's about what it means to give and to be forgotten, and what it feels like when someone remembers, not for fame, but for love." Over the next few days, Lena returned with a voice recorder and a heart open to listening. Clara spoke from the old armchair by the window, her voice slow and precise, pausing when the memories caught in her throat. She spoke of her childhood in Mississippi, her mother's tired hands scrubbing floors, the way poverty clung like dust in corners no one could reach. She told Lena about moving west with nothing but a suitcase and a prayer. She talked about the families she served, some kind, others cruel, and how she carried dignity in her back pocket like a folded handkerchief. And then she spoke about the boy, the one who never shouted, the one who sat quietly beside her as she folded laundry, asking why the moon followed the car, the one who never saw her as just the maid. Lena didn't interrupt. She only nodded, writing down quotes as tears filled her eyes. Because what Clara gave wasn't just a story. It was a window into every invisible woman who had ever loved, quietly, and endured without applause. And Clara was finally ready for the world to hear it. Lena returned the next afternoon with a photographer, a woman named Nina with a soft voice and a camera that never clicked too loudly. Clara had agreed to the photos, but only after one condition. "No glamour shots. I want them to see me as I am, wrinkles and all." She sat at the small kitchen table, her hands folded over a well-worn Bible. Nina took photos while Clara brewed tea, while she stared out the window at the birds, and while she gently dusted off a photo of her and Jasmine at Jasmine's high school graduation. In every image, Clara looked exactly as she felt. Strong, tired, proud, and still standing. That weekend, Lena's article was published in a national outlet under the headline, "The Woman Who Helped Raise the Quietest Man in Hollywood," and stayed silent until now. But the story wasn't really about Keanu, not this time. Lena wrote about Clara's early life, the families she worked for, and the decades she spent giving without ever being seen. She included Clara's words exactly as spoken, unedited, untouched. "We weren't housekeepers. We were quiet architects of homes. We held things together no one else noticed were falling apart." She wrote about the eviction notice Clara had once received, and the pride that kept her from asking for help. She quoted Clara's reflection on caregiving, how the best caregivers left no fingerprints, only peace in their wake. And she told the story of a boy who, years later, found his way back to say thank you, not through press conferences or grand gestures, but by remembering what kind of tea she liked. The article exploded online within hours. Not because of Keanu Reeves, although his name did catch attention, but because of Clara. Because people saw in her someone they knew. A grandmother, a teacher, a neighbor who brought soup when your mother was sick, a woman who gave and gave and gave and never asked for applause. The comment section filled with gratitude and heartbreak. Thousands of readers, especially women, shared their own stories. My Nana cleaned houses until she was 82. This reminds me of Miss Rosa, who raised me when my mama worked night shifts. She's my hero. More stories like hers, please. A trending hashtag emerged organically. She never stopped giving. And it wasn't just talk. Donations flooded in to support a new nonprofit Clara and Jasmine had quietly founded after Keanu's support, the Dignity Quilt, a program designed to support aging caregivers with housing, health care, and a sense of community. Jasmine had come up with the name after wrapping Clara in the patchwork quilt Keanu had gifted her, the same one from her youth, now restored and placed over her favorite chair. Lena checked in a few days after publication, breathless with disbelief. "It's happening, Clara. People are listening. You're not just a story. You're a movement." Clara didn't say much. She only smiled, her eyes shining as she stirred sugar into her tea. She hadn't wanted the spotlight, but now that she had it, she wasn't wasting it. Not for vanity, but for every woman who gave their whole life without ever being seen. A week later, Clara was invited to speak at a caregivers conference in Sacramento. She wore a simple blue dress and walked to the podium with Jasmine by her side. No notes, no teleprompter. "I was never famous," she said into the microphone, voice steady. "But I was never invisible either, not to the children I held, not to the lives I touched." The room rose to their feet in silence. In that moment, Clara wasn't just telling her story. She was reclaiming it, and the world was finally listening. It began slowly, like ripples on a still lake. After Lena Tran's article was published, the attention was not loud or viral in the way people expected. There were no tabloids camped outside Clara's new apartment, no paparazzi swarming Keanu, no trending hashtags fueled by gossip or spectacle. Instead, the impact was quiet, intentionally so. Clara's story resonated with people in a different way. It wasn't a story about fame or money. It was a story about memory, gratitude, and the simple, profound act of showing up for someone when no one else does. And that, it turned out, struck a chord far deeper than any celebrity drama ever could. Donations began arriving at elder care charities and community caregiving organizations across the country, sometimes anonymously, sometimes with notes that simply said, "In honor of Clara." One Midwestern nonprofit received a check for $10,000 from someone who asked for nothing in return. Another in the Bronx opened a new program offering part-time support to aging home aides who could no longer work full-time. Jasmine, still stunned by everything that had happened, watched the quiet wave of kindness spread outward. She started getting emails through the contact form Lena had shared. Messages from caregivers, nurses, housekeepers, even retired teachers. Many of them weren't asking for help. They were just thanking Clara. One email read, "My mom cleaned houses for 40 years. She passed away before anyone ever thanked her for it. I cried reading about Clara. Please tell her she made me remember my mom with pride." Clara read each message. She didn't reply to most. She didn't know what to say. But she saved them all. She printed some and taped them to the inside of a cabinet door in her kitchen. Every morning she'd open it and read one. It reminded her that her life had never been small. It had just been quiet. Meanwhile, Claire quietly asked Keanu if he wanted to make a public comment. The article had circled back through various outlets with increasing calls for a quote. She didn't push. She never did. She just asked. Keanu didn't answer immediately. He sat in silence, elbows on the kitchen table, a mug cooling in front of him. Finally, he said, "If we say something, it has to be about her. Not me, not even us. Just her." Claire nodded. "I'll write a draft." When the statement was released, it was just a single sentence. No press conference, no photo, just words. Some people shape lives by simply showing up. Clara showed up for me. That was it. The quote spread faster than expected, not because of who said it, but because of what it meant. In a world noisy with influencers and algorithms, those few words stood out like a whisper in a crowded room. Teachers printed it on the walls of their classrooms. Social workers shared it on bulletin boards. Nursing homes taped it beside their staff break room coffee pots. It was the kind of sentiment people didn't just repost, they held onto it. Soon, publications from The Atlantic to small-town newsletters began writing think pieces not about Keanu, but about caregivers, those who rarely get credit but often make the greatest difference. And always, Clara's name was mentioned with reverence, not pity. But if the public saw a movement growing from this, Clara didn't see it that way. She still made her bed each morning with hospital corners, still brewed her tea strong and sweet, still walked with a slow steadiness, the creak in her knees more tolerable now with proper treatment. She volunteered 3 times a week at the local community center, reading to children, many of whom had never known the soft, structured love of a grandparent. And she never once called herself a hero. She'd say, "I just did my job, and I was lucky I got to do it for someone like him." One afternoon, Jasmine brought home a small stack of printed letters she found waiting in the building's mailroom. Most had been rerouted from an address no longer in use, and it was clear someone, probably Claire, had carefully sorted through them and sent only the ones Clara would want to see. They came from all over: Canada, the UK, Singapore, rural Alabama, a school in Alaska. And they weren't just thank you letters, they were testaments. One was from a man whose grandmother had worked as a nanny for decades and passed away before he could afford to give her the comfort she deserved. He wrote, "Clara's story gave me peace. She reminds me that dignity isn't found in who praises you, but in how you carry your love." Another was from a teenage girl caring for her younger siblings while her parents worked night shifts. She wrote, "I used to think nobody noticed, that what I was doing didn't matter. Now I know. It does. It always did." Clara cried as she read them. And yet, when reporters tried to push for more, when invitations came for talk shows or headlines begging for exclusives, Clara declined them all. Not with anger, just with quiet certainty. "My story's already out there," she'd say. "The rest belongs to me." Keanu never mentioned the article again, never referenced the viral moment. But when he called, his voice had something extra in it, a tenderness even deeper than before. He visited once more a month after the article's release, brought her more of her favorite tea, sat beside her on the patio while Jasmine baked banana bread in the kitchen. They didn't talk about the fame, or the money, or the quotes, or the movement. They talked about Clara's rosebush, which had just begun to bloom, the pink flowers stretching in the sunlight, the same kind she used to grow behind Keanu's childhood home, in the tiny patch of dirt near the back steps. "Still got that stubborn beauty," Clara said softly, running a hand across a blossom. "So do you," Keanu replied. They didn't need to say more. Because the greatest things, gratitude, memory, respect, don't always need headlines. Sometimes they just need to be seen. Truly seen. And in that quiet moment, with the scent of roses in the air and 2 people sitting in the peace they'd both earned, everything that needed to be said already had been. The morning light stretched across the edge of a quiet hillside property, where laughter echoed faintly from a playground tucked behind rows of freshly painted white cottages. This was the Whisper Haven Children's Home, a place most people didn't know Keanu Reeves quietly funded, preferring to let the focus remain on the children rather than the man behind the scenes. But today there was a gentle hum of something new. A small team of volunteers moved soil, planted shrubs, and arranged stones in what would soon be a garden unlike any other. Clara James stood at the center of it all, gloves on her hands, a wide-brimmed sun hat shading her face. She leaned slightly on her cane but moved with a sense of purpose, her gaze fixed on the raised flower beds that were slowly taking shape. It had been Keanu's idea. "I want something living," he had said one day. "Something quiet, something that grows." And he wanted her to help him build it. She remembered sitting across from him in his kitchen weeks earlier, jasmine tea between them, when he first spoke the words. His voice had been soft, thoughtful. "I've tried to thank you in ways that make sense to me, but I keep thinking, maybe there's a better way. One that reflects what you gave me, not just to me, but to others. You helped me grow. Maybe we can build something that lets others do the same." At first, Clara had hesitated. She wasn't used to being part of projects that lasted beyond her own footsteps. Her whole life had been lived in the background, her presence quiet, her impact unspoken. But Keanu had insisted. "I'd like you to design it with me, from scratch. Not a statue, not a plaque, something real." Now, standing in the middle of the space they had marked off together, she realized it wasn't just real, it was meaningful. The garden was modest in size, nestled between the playground and the main children's residence, but everything about it had been chosen with intention. There were wide walkways so even the elderly could stroll easily, benches made from reclaimed wood, and low walls painted with quotes by the children. Things like, "Thank you for believing in me," and "I feel seen here." Roses were the first flowers planted, Clara's choice. "My mother always said roses are honest flowers," she had told Keanu. "They don't pretend to be perfect, but they show up anyway, thorns and all. That's real beauty." Keanu had smiled at that. Now, as Clara knelt to settle the roots of a blushing pink rose into the soil, her granddaughter Jasmine appeared at her side with a watering can in hand. "Need help, Grandma?" Clara looked up, her face streaked with both sweat and sunshine. "Always." Jasmine had started volunteering at Whisperhaven after seeing what this project meant to her grandmother. She'd been searching for direction after finishing school, unsure of her path, but something about this place, its warmth, its mission, its quiet purpose, had stirred something in her. Together they worked in tandem. Jasmine gently poured water, while Clara brushed dirt around the roots, anchoring the flower in place. It was slow work, but sacred somehow. And just a few feet away, beneath the shade of a small oak, a stone plaque had already been set. Its inscription was simple, but it stopped Clara in her tracks the first time she saw it. "To the unseen hands who carry futures." She had read it twice. Then again, her breath catching somewhere between recognition and reverence. Clara read the plaque again. Her hand rested gently on the stone, the inscription etched deep. "Plain, graceful, and true. The unseen hands who carry futures." It echoed in her chest, more powerful than any award or headline could ever be. Keanu hadn't told her about the plaque. He hadn't needed to. She felt it in the details, in the way the garden curved around a bench shaped like an open book, in the bird bath nestled beneath the wisteria, and in the simple wind chimes that hung from the cedar trellis. Soft-spoken music for soft-spoken people. Later that afternoon, he arrived. No entourage, no cameras, just Keanu in a plain gray t-shirt, jeans, and that familiar calm energy that somehow filled a space without demanding it. He carried a small wooden box, and when Clara raised her brows at it, he smiled. "Thought we could add something to the garden," he said. She nodded, brushing soil from her gloves. They sat together beneath the oak. Jasmine gave them space, watching from a few feet away, still holding the watering can. She sensed this moment wasn't hers to join, but something sacred to witness. Keanu opened the box and pulled out a small, well-worn object. A child's drawing. Folded, faded, but preserved. "I made this when I was 8, he said. "You taped it to the fridge." Clara laughed softly, covering her mouth. "That rocket ship, with the stick figure astronaut." "You said it looked like it could really fly," he added, eyes still on the drawing. "That's the first time I believed maybe it could." He stood and walked to a small frame that had been built into the garden wall, a glass panel already mounted. He placed the drawing behind the glass and gently slid the latch shut. Below it, another inscription had been added. "Believe in the ones who dream quietly." Clara's throat tightened. "I used to think no one saw me," she said, her voice a soft breeze in the garden air. "I thought I was background in everyone's story, just a hand with a rag or a voice reminding someone to eat. I never thought anyone remembered." Keanu turned, his expression holding something stronger than sadness, something like awe. "You weren't the background, you were the foundation." They sat again, no more words needed. The sun dipped a little lower, casting the garden in a wash of gold and amber. Children's laughter bubbled from the nearby swing set, soft and high and alive. Jasmine finally approached, kneeling beside them with a trowel in hand. "I saved one last plant for you both," she said. "You should plant it together." It was a night-blooming jasmine. Clara let out a breath. "You sneaky girl." "I thought it fit," Jasmine said. "We bloom when no one expects it, right?" Keanu nodded, his smile slow but deep. "Right." Together, the three of them lowered the jasmine into the earth. 3 generations, tied by quiet strength, shared memory, and a garden that would outlast them all. No one watching from the outside would have seen the full weight of that moment, but inside that garden, among the roses and roots, something unspoken was planted too: gratitude. Finally seen, finally returned. The morning sunlight spilled through the gauzy curtains in Clara's new bedroom, casting soft gold on the floral quilt tucked around her legs. It was the kind of light that used to signal a long day of scrubbing and kneeling, but now it only meant one thing: rest. For the first time in years, she didn't have to rush. She took a slow sip of her favorite tea, her hands steady as she cradled the ceramic mug. The sharp, aching stiffness in her knuckles that once greeted her every morning was dull, manageable, almost absent. She blinked down at her hands, then flexed them. No crack, no wince. A soft chuckle escaped her lips. "What on earth is happening to me?" Later that morning, Jasmine walked her into the clinic, the one Keanu had quietly arranged within walking distance of the apartment. It didn't feel like a hospital. There were no sterile white walls or endless buzzers. It felt more like a spa tucked into a library. Paintings of wildflowers adorned the rooms, and the nurses greeted Clara by name. Dr. Moreno, a gentle woman with silver-streaked hair and bright, watchful eyes, entered with a warm smile. "Ms. James, today we'll be running some deeper tests, your full diagnostics," she said, carefully explaining each step. "Blood work, scans, imaging. It'll take a little time, but we'll get a full picture of your health." Clara had been through countless checkups before, but never like this. Never without the ticking clock of insurance. Never without watching the nurse's expression for signs of what they weren't telling her. But here, everything felt different, personal, thorough, respectful. When the tests were finished, Dr. Moreno took a seat beside her. "Miss James," she said gently, "I have some good news, and a bit of a surprise." Clara braced herself. Good news was often the sugar before the medicine. "You've been living with untreated rheumatoid arthritis for nearly 20 years, Dr. Moreno said. "That's why your joints have been so inflamed. But here's the thing, your case is manageable. With the right treatment plan, we can significantly reduce your pain, maybe even reverse some of the damage." Clara stared at her. "You mean, you don't have to live with that pain anymore." She couldn't speak. Her throat tightened. All those years she'd forced herself to work through it. All the time she'd told Jasmine not to worry, told herself it was just age, just wear and tear. All that time, help had simply been out of reach. Jasmine, who had been standing quietly in the corner, burst into tears. "Grandma," she whispered, covering her mouth, "I didn't know it was treatable." Clara reached for her hand. "Neither did I, baby." Dr. Moreno handed Clara a small folder with the treatment plan inside. Medications, physical therapy, regular follow-ups, even a nutritional consultation. "And don't worry about cost," she said gently. "Everything's been arranged." Clara didn't need to ask by whom. She closed the folder, her voice trembling. "I don't know what to call this. Dr. Moreno smiled. Most people call it a miracle. Clara nodded slowly. No. This is love. When they returned home, Clara sat in her favorite chair on the patio, watching the birds flutter around the feeder Jasmine had installed. The world looked different, not because it had changed, but because for the first time she could sit still and simply witness it. No pain shadowed her vision, no dread about how she'd manage tomorrow. Jasmine brought her a blanket and wrapped it gently around her shoulders. "Do you feel it?" she asked. Clara turned to her, smiling faintly. "Feel what, baby?" "The peace." Clara chuckled. "I'm still trying to believe it's real." Over the next few weeks, her treatments began in earnest. A nurse came twice a week to administer injections and monitor her vitals. The medications reduced her swelling dramatically. With the help of a physical therapist, Clara learned how to walk longer distances without support. Her steps grew more confident, and her posture straightened. One afternoon, she even went grocery shopping with Jasmine. Slowly, carefully, but without needing to lean on the cart for balance. But the most emotional moment came on a quiet Sunday morning. Clara woke up, stood from her bed, walked into the kitchen, and realized something profound. She hadn't thought about her pain, not once. The realization hit her like a wave. She reached for her cane, out of habit, but paused. Then, with trembling hands, she placed it against the wall. Jasmine watched from the hallway, her face covered in disbelief. "Grandma, are you okay?" Clara nodded, her voice catching. "I walked without thinking." Jasmine rushed to hug her, tears welling up again. "You haven't done that since I was little." "No," Clara whispered. "I haven't." Later that day, a small envelope arrived in the mailbox. Handwritten, no return address. Inside was a folded note in Keanu's unmistakable script. "You showed me how to carry pain with grace. Now let me carry it for you." No cameras, no headlines, just gratitude. Clara read the letter again and again, the tears she'd held back finally falling. She pressed the note to her chest, breathing in the warmth of something beyond words, something that didn't come from fame or fortune, but from memory and meaning. A boy, who had once been awkward and quiet, had become a man of action and silence. That evening, Jasmine found her sitting on the edge of the bed, staring at her hands. "Do you think people ever really know," Clara asked softly, "what they meant to someone?" Jasmine knelt before her. "I think some people do." Clara placed her hand gently on Jasmine's cheek. "Then, I hope you always know." In that small apartment, once filled with quiet worry, there was now a different kind of quiet. Not fear, not struggle, just peace and gratitude. Spring melted into early summer, and the days stretched longer. Clara began to spend more time outside, sitting under the shade of the old magnolia tree that stood in the corner of her apartment's courtyard. It had been there for decades, much like she had, silent, reliable, rooted. But now, she wasn't just surviving beneath it, she was living. Neighbors started to notice the change. Mrs. Eloise from across the hall remarked, "You look 10 years younger, Clara. What's your secret?" Clara smiled, adjusting her wide-brimmed hat. "Love," she said simply, "and someone who remembered." The truth was, Clara had never wanted anything. Not really. She had never expected gratitude or recognition. Her reward had always been knowing she'd helped raise a child with gentleness and care. But this was more than a gift. It was healing, in the most sacred sense of the word. One morning, a small gathering was held in the garden outside the community health center. The staff had heard Clara's story through Jasmine, and one nurse in particular, a young woman named Amina, had been deeply moved. "You're the reason I chose elder care," she said shyly, handing Clara a bouquet of yellow tulips. "Your story reminded me of my own grandmother." Clara blinked, overwhelmed. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," Amina replied. "You already did, just by living it." Later that day, Keanu called. Not with fanfare, not with cameras, just a gentle voice through the phone. "I heard you walked without your cane." Clara laughed. "I did. Almost forgot how tall I am." "That's wonderful," Keanu said, a smile clear in his tone. Jasmine sent a photo. Of me hobbling around the fruit aisle like I owned the place? "No, of you smiling," he said. "You looked light." There was a pause, soft but full. "Thank you, Keanu," Clara said finally. "I never asked for any of this, you know." "I know," he replied. "That's why it mattered so much to give it." When she hung up, Clara looked out at the flowers lining her walkway. Jasmine had planted them with the same energy Clara once poured into the homes she cleaned. Quiet care, precise hands, lasting beauty. It was strange, she thought, how life had come full circle. Once she gave love with no guarantee it would ever return. Now it had found its way back to her. Not in the way she imagined, but in a form more powerful than she believed possible. She whispered into the warm wind that afternoon as a hummingbird danced near the feeder. "This is grace." Because the gift she never asked for had found her, at last. And in her heart, she finally knew it wasn't just a miracle. It was love, remembered, returned, and real. The morning air was cool as the car made its way through the quiet streets of East Hollywood. Clara James sat in the passenger seat, her hands resting in her lap, fingers gently twisting the edge of a handkerchief. Her eyes scanned the neighborhoods they passed, familiar and unfamiliar at once. Time had shifted the lines, painted over the corners, but some things, like the old mailboxes and the way the sun hit those narrow sidewalks, remained untouched. Beside her, Keanu drove without speaking. He glanced at her once in a while, but mostly he let the silence hold them both. It wasn't an awkward silence. It was thick with memory. Clara hadn't been back to this side of town in years. Not since her knees started giving out and the walk from the bus stop felt longer than it really was. The buildings had changed, the faces had changed, but her memories had not. Every block whispered something back to her. "You still haven't told me what we're doing here," she said with a playful tone, though her voice was softer now, aged with grace and uncertainty. Keanu smiled faintly. "You'll see." She narrowed her eyes at him, trying to read between his gentle smile. But as always, Keanu kept most of himself tucked just below the surface. They made a left turn onto a narrow side street, one Clara hadn't seen in decades, and there it was. The house. Or what had once been the house. Clara's breath caught. It was different now. The old white paint was replaced with a soft blue. The porch had been redone. A bright sign out front read, "The James Literacy and Storytelling Center." Beneath it, in smaller lettering, was a simple phrase, "Because every child deserves to be heard." She turned to Keanu, her voice caught in her throat. "Is this?" He nodded, parking the car slowly. "This was the house," he said quietly. "I bought it a few years ago. Didn't know what to do with it, but after you moved into your new place, after the garden, I started thinking." Clara stared at the center, blinking fast. Children's voices echoed from somewhere inside. Books lined the windowsills, murals of open hands and constellations painted the sidewalls. And right there, on the gate, was a plaque. "In honor of Clara James, the woman who first told me I could be more than what I saw." Clara pressed a hand to her chest. Keanu opened his door and walked around to open hers. He extended a hand. She took it slowly, still trying to process. The air smelled like jasmine, like old memories made new. "Come on," he said gently. "There's more." Clara stepped through the front doors with Keanu by her side, her feet crossing the threshold of a place that had once echoed with small footsteps, mumbled prayers, and the creak of mop buckets. But now, it was light and laughter that filled the halls. The interior had been transformed, yet some of it was eerily familiar. The floor plan was intact. The room still followed the same shape, but where a cold, formal dining room had once sat, There was now a circular storytelling area lined with cushions, beanbags, and a sunken bookshelf at the center. Bright murals lined the walls, one of a woman reading to a boy beneath a tree, painted with warm hues that almost glowed. Clara's eyes welled with tears. "Is that... It's you," Keanu said softly. "Well, it's how I remember you." The mural depicted a younger version of Clara, one hand resting on a book, the other raised mid-story, animated, vibrant. A boy sat at her feet, listening with eyes wide open. It was unmistakably Keanu as a child. She put a hand to her lips, overcome. "It's a storytelling room," Keanu explained, "for kids who've been through a lot. Some are in foster care, some can't read yet, some just need someone to listen." Clara walked slowly through the room. Along the walls were framed photos, not of Keanu's movies or red carpets, but of teachers, nurses, bus drivers, and home aides. Under each one was a single quote from a child they had mentored or helped. In the back corner of the room, tucked under a large stained glass window, was a small enclosed nook with 2 armchairs and a handmade quilt. Clara stopped in front of it. She reached down and touched the quilt. Her fingers trembled. "This was mine," she whispered. "My mama made this for me before I came to LA." Keanu nodded. "We found it in a charity shop a few years ago. I knew the pattern. I remembered the stitching. It took a while, but we traced it back to you." Clara sank into the armchair, her hand still resting on the fabric. "This isn't just for me," she said finally. "No," Keanu agreed. "It's for everyone who ever poured into a child and thought it didn't matter." It did. She looked up at him, her eyes shining. "Why now?" He crouched beside her, his voice barely above a whisper. "Because you once said you'd be forgotten," he said, his gaze steady. "And I needed to prove you wrong." Clara exhaled sharply, her hand reaching for his. "You have." As the afternoon light filtered in through the stained glass window, Clara walked with Keanu into a second room just beyond the reading nook. It was smaller, quieter, but filled with an unmistakable reverence. Along one wall stood a row of bookshelves, each shelf carefully arranged with classic novels, children's stories, and a few tattered books with handwritten labels on their spines. Clara leaned in and gasped. "These are mine," she whispered. "The ones I used to read you. A Wrinkle in Time, The Secret Garden. Lord, even that old poetry collection I thought I lost in a move." Keanu smiled. "You didn't lose it. I borrowed it and never gave it back." She laughed, a full, belly-deep laugh that filled the room with warmth. "I should scold you," she said, shaking her head. "But you won't," he grinned, "because now they're right where they belong." In the center of the room stood a glass case. Inside was an old, well-worn apron. A small engraved plaque beneath it read, "Clara James, quiet strength, endless love." Clara stared at it for a long time. "I only wore that because I had to," she murmured. "And we honor it because you chose to wear it with grace," Keanu said. She turned to him. "Do the kids know who I am?" "They will," he replied. "But not because you raised a famous actor. Because you raised a boy who needed to be seen, who needed someone to believe in him when the world didn't understand him. That's the story we're telling here." She felt the tears come again, but this time they weren't from sorrow or exhaustion. They were release, gratitude, peace. Outside, children had begun to arrive, laughter spilling through the halls. Some had backpacks slung over tiny shoulders. Others held hands with social workers or volunteers. Jasmine was among them, helping a group of first graders hang up their jackets. Keanu turned to Clara. "You want to meet them?" Clara nodded, "Of course." She was introduced as Ms. Clara, and the children greeted her with shy smiles and waves. One little girl threw her arms around Clara's waist without hesitation. "I like your dress," she said. "I like your spirit," Clara replied, eyes twinkling. As they walked back into the reading room, Keanu reached into his jacket and handed her a folded piece of paper. She opened it slowly, reading the dedication aloud. "To the unseen hands who carry futures. Your love was not invisible. It carried the stars." Her hand covered her heart. "You wrote this?" He nodded. Every word. They stood together as the children settled onto cushions, waiting for a story. Clara took a seat, opened an old favorite book, and began to read. And for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel like a woman from someone's past. She felt like someone who had finally arrived at her purpose, carrying futures, just as she always had. The ceremony had long passed, the photos had faded from news feeds, the world had moved on. But not Keanu, and certainly not Clara. The following spring, a quiet announcement was made, not on television, not in headlines, but in a simple newsletter mailed to nonprofit directors, caregivers unions, and elder care foundations across the country. The letter was written without flair. No celebrity signature, no logo, just a statement. For every life quietly lifted by unseen hands, this is for you. In honor of Clara James and all who shaped lives without ever asking for anything in return. Below it, the details were clear. A $25 million grant distributed annually to fund housing, medical support, and respite care for elder caregivers who had spent their lives in domestic labor, often without retirement or insurance. It wasn't just a one-time gesture, it was a permanent structure, protected, renewing, invisible, like the people it honored. It was Keanu's doing, but he refused to speak about it publicly. Claire had asked him once, gently, "Wouldn't it help to bring attention if people knew you were behind this?" He had only smiled. "They don't need to know I gave it," he said. "They just need to know someone saw them." And somehow, that made it stronger. The first letter arrived 2 weeks later at Clara's apartment. Handwritten, slanted script, a stamp from Kansas. It read, "Dear Ms. James, I'm 72 and still cleaning houses. I saw your story. I didn't think people like us were ever seen, but you helped me feel like maybe we mattered. Thank you." Clara sat on her porch, the morning sun warm against her knees, that letter trembling in her hands. More came. From a retired nanny in Ohio. From a hospice worker in New Mexico. From a Filipino immigrant in Seattle who had cared for 14 families across 45 years. They all said the same thing in different ways. "You helped me feel seen." Clara kept them in a wooden box by her bed. Jasmine had given it to her, painted it with roses and constellations, the lid stenciled with the words, "To the unseen hands." She read the letters slowly, savoring each one like a sacred hymn. They weren't thank yous for a donation or a program. They were messages of shared dignity. Keanu never asked to see the letters, but Claire collected anonymous notes and data. She updated him once a month. The impact, she told him, was exponential. Quiet waves were spreading. Small acts of kindness multiplying across communities. A caregiver center in Detroit had reopened. A retirement apartment complex in Tulsa was renamed the James House. A support group in Phoenix called themselves Clara's Circle. Still, he asked for no recognition. Clara's life, once small and filled with aching silence, had become a kind of quiet beacon. One afternoon, she was invited to speak on a virtual panel for National Caregivers Day. She almost declined. Technology still intimidated her, and public speaking had never been her dream. But Jasmine insisted, sitting beside her and promising to handle the screen. So Clara spoke, not with polish, not with power, but with presence. "I never thought I'd be known," she said, "not for folding towels, or bandaging scraped knees, or teaching a boy how to tie a tie when his own father wouldn't. But I see now that showing up matters. That love, even when small, leaves a mark." The chat box filled with hearts. One woman wrote, "I cried during this. My grandmother was a caregiver and died without anyone ever saying thank you." Another, "You're the reason I applied for that caregiver grant. I couldn't afford medicine last year. Now I can." Clara looked at Jasmine and blinked through tears. "I didn't know it would mean so much." Jasmine squeezed her hand. It does, Grandma. It really does. That evening, after the panel ended, Clara returned to her chair on the porch. She brewed herself a cup of tea, lemon ginger, her favorite, and let the steam wrap around her like an old friend. In the distance, the sky was streaked with lavender and rose. A peace she hadn't known in years settled into her bones. Inside, her phone vibrated, a text from Claire. "You spoke beautifully today. Just wanted you to know." See, Clara smiled. This was the kind of fame she could accept. Not flashing cameras, not screaming fans, but this. Being known quietly for something that mattered. Across the country, small ripples continued. A grocery store in San Diego posted a sign. Elder caregivers get 20% off every Tuesday. Because you matter. A fifth-grade teacher in Vermont asked her class to write essays titled, "Who Showed Up for You, Even When No One Noticed?" A social worker in New Jersey emailed Claire, asking if they could replicate the grant in their local district. "We want to name it the Clara Standard," she wrote. Claire forwarded the message to Keanu. He responded with 2 words, "Let's help." He didn't speak often about the legacy he was building, not even to Claire, but she knew what it meant. Every act of care given without thanks, he was trying to give it back, one unseen soul at a time. And it all traced back to that tiny apartment where Clara had once worked herself to exhaustion, believing the world had moved on without her. Now the world was whispering her name in acts of kindness. One morning, a thick envelope arrived in Clara's mailbox. No return address, just her name in neat handwriting. She opened it at the kitchen table while Jasmine made pancakes. Inside were dozens of handwritten letters. From a retired nurse in Kentucky. "I cared for my neighbor with Alzheimer's for 10 years. Your story gave me dignity I didn't know I needed." From a young woman in Georgia. "I'm only 23, caring for my grandmother. Some days I feel invisible, but now I feel seen. Thank you." And from a boy no older than 10. "My mom helps my great-grandma. I think she's a hero. You too." Clara wept softly over her tea, overwhelmed not by grief, but by grace. These were not letters of pity. They were tributes, mirrors of her life echoing back at her. She folded them one by one and placed them in a wooden box she labeled Proof. That night, as she turned out the light and sat beneath her favorite quilt, Clara whispered into the dark, "I was never invisible." For the first time in decades, she truly believed it. The auditorium echoed with applause as graduates in white coats crossed the stage one by one. Proud families filled every seat, cheering, clapping, some wiping away tears. But in the far left corner of the audience, near the aisle, sat an older woman with silver hair and eyes that shimmered with quiet pride. Clara James wasn't cheering loudly. She didn't have to. Her pride was deeper than sound, rooted in decades of sacrifice, struggle, and quiet hope. On stage, Jasmine adjusted her cap nervously, glancing into the crowd. When her name was called, "Jasmine Elise James, Bachelor of Science in Nursing," Clara rose to her feet. The applause surged again. Jasmine's smile lit up the entire room. Clara's hands trembled as she clapped, her eyes never leaving the girl she had once braided hair for by candlelight in a cramped apartment, while skipping dinner to make sure Jasmine ate. The same girl who used to crawl into bed beside her when thunder scared her. The same girl who whispered, "Someday I'll take care of you, Grandma. I promise." That promise echoed now, not in words, but in action. The scholarship Keanu had quietly established in Clara's name had paid for Jasmine's entire education. No debt, no struggle, just pure opportunity. Jasmine had never forgotten who made that possible, and Clara never let her forget where she came from. As Jasmine stepped down from the stage, her eyes locked with Clara's. She didn't wave, she didn't shout. She simply mouthed the words, "Thank you." Clara nodded, tears slipping silently down her face. After the ceremony, Clara waited near the edge of the crowd. Parents hugged their children, balloons floated above, and cameras flashed everywhere. Jasmine weaved through it all, heading straight for her. And when she reached her grandmother, she dropped her bag, wrapped her arms around Clara's shoulders, and sobbed into her neck. "You did it," Clara whispered, pressing her cheek into Jasmine's curls. "You kept your promise." Jasmine pulled back, her eyes shining. "No, Grandma, you did. You kept us going when no one else could." Clara smiled softly. "God kept us going. I just held the broom." They both laughed through tears. "Someone wants to give you something," Jasmine said, reaching into her bag and pulling out a small envelope. It arrived this morning. Clara's brow furrowed as she took it. No return address, just her name in elegant script. She opened it slowly, her hands trembling again, but this time from something other than arthritis. Inside was a single card, no fanfare, just a message in Keanu's unmistakable handwriting. "You were always my hero. Love, Keanu." Clara pressed the card to her chest, not because she needed to read it again, but because she needed to feel the truth of it. She had spent her entire life lifting others, quietly, gently, without asking for anything in return. And now, at this late hour of her journey, the universe had whispered back. Not with headlines, not with riches, but with something she'd given freely her whole life: love. Clara sat with Jasmine on a wooden bench outside the auditorium, watching the late afternoon sunlight stretch across the parking lot. The sky was golden, and the air carried the kind of warmth that only came with spring. Soft, forgiving, full of promise. Jasmine held her grandmother's hand, her nursing pin catching the light as it swung gently from her lapel. "Do you remember when I used to pretend to be a nurse?" she asked with a laugh. "You'd wrap my dolls in paper towels and let me check your pulse with a popsicle stick." Clara chuckled, her eyes sparkling. "You took it so serious, like that little doll was going to flatline if you didn't act fast." "I didn't know it then," Jasmine said, her voice softening, "but I was practicing for you." Clara turned to her granddaughter with a tender, almost wistful look. "You've already given me more than I could have ever dreamed, baby." "But you gave me everything," Jasmine said. "You gave me love when we had nothing. You gave me stories when I was scared. You gave me strength when I didn't know what that word even meant." Clara's hand closed over the card from Keanu, still tucked in her dress pocket. "Seems like God's been tying up all the threads." Jasmine tilted her head. "What do you mean?" Clara looked out at the sky, her gaze drifting toward the horizon. "For a long time, I thought I'd just be a name on some lease papers, a person who passed through this world without ever really leaving a mark. But then, that boy I looked after turned into a man who never forgot. You turned into a woman who carries love like armor. And me? I get to sit here and feel it all come back. Full circle." Jasmine rested her head on her grandmother's shoulder. "You've always left a mark. You just didn't stop to look behind you." They sat like that for a long time. 2 generations, 1 story, and a single unbreakable thread between them. The applause from the auditorium had faded, but in that quiet corner of the world, something far louder was echoing. Legacy. Later that evening, after Jasmine's graduation dinner, Clara sat on the porch of her quiet apartment. The air was calm, the streetlight flickered gently across the sidewalk. In her lap rested a small, weathered envelope. It had arrived earlier that week, no return address, but she knew the handwriting. With careful fingers, she unfolded the letter. The paper smelled faintly of sandalwood. "Dear Clara, I didn't have the right words then. I probably still don't. But I've carried what you gave me every day of my life. The steadiness, the quiet strength, the way you showed up, even when no one asked you to. You once told me, life isn't about being remembered. It's about doing right when no one's looking. But you were wrong about one thing. I remembered. You were always my hero, with all my love and gratitude. Keanu." Clara pressed the letter to her chest, eyes brimming with quiet tears. Not sadness, not even pride. Just peace. In the distance, she could hear Jasmine's laughter through the screen door. The sound of youth, of hope, of everything she'd fought for continuing on. She looked up at the stars. They blinked back at her, scattered like memories across a velvet sky. And she whispered, "Thank you, baby, for seeing me." In that moment, beneath the hush of night and the soft hum of a world still spinning, Clara James became eternal. Not through fame or fortune, but through the hearts she shaped with quiet, invisible hands. The sun rose slowly over the small neighborhood clinic tucked between a bakery and an elementary school. The new sign out front hadn't even been weathered yet. It still gleamed with fresh white paint and bold blue letters. Inside, boxes were being unpacked, charts sorted, and hallways filled with new sounds. Footsteps of nervous patients, laughter from nurses meeting for the first time, and the low hum of fluorescent lights warming to life. Out front, two women stood quietly on the sidewalk. Jasmine adjusted her white coat nervously. Her name was embroidered in small lettering on the chest, Jasmine James, RN. Her hair was pulled back neatly. She wore simple earrings and no makeup, but her smile radiated enough warmth to light the entire entrance. Beside her stood Clara in a pale blue cardigan and soft brown slacks. She looked different now. Lighter, somehow. Her steps had steadied. Her shoulders no longer carried that weight that once made her look older than her years. She placed a gentle hand on Jasmine's shoulder, steadying her. "James, you ready?" Clara asked softly. Jasmine nodded. "I think so. Are you coming in?" Clara smiled. "I'll walk you to the door." As they stepped forward together, Clara's hand remained on her granddaughter's shoulder. It was a quiet gesture, but one filled with so many years of sacrifice, love, and belief. A full-circle moment, but understood by them both. Inside, Jasmine was greeted by a small team of staff. New beginnings, nervous introductions. But her eyes kept glancing toward the door, where Clara still stood, watching with pride. For a moment, neither said anything. But Jasmine raised her hand in a small wave, and Clara returned it. And just like that, the torch had been passed. Later that afternoon, far away from the city's rush, Keanu sat alone in a quiet studio. He was recording a short audio tribute, something he had written himself. There were no press cameras, no reporters, just him, a microphone, and a note from Claire reminding him to breathe through the pauses. His voice came through, steady, warm, a little deeper than usual. Sometimes the people who shape us most are the ones the world never sees. They're not in history books, they don't stand on stages, they don't wear medals or give speeches. They just show up. They hold your hand when you're sick. They wash the dishes when no one's watching. They read to you under flickering lamps. They listen when you think no one else would. They give not for applause, but because that's who they are. They don't ask for recognition, but they deserve it anyway. I was raised by one of those people. She wasn't my mother. She wasn't famous. But she made sure I was fed. She made sure I was kind. She made sure I never forgot where I came from. Her name is Clara James. And if she hadn't been there, I don't know if I would be here. After the recording ended, there was a pause. Keanu didn't ask to review it. He simply stood, nodded to the technician, and walked out the door, into the sunlight. The short tribute aired quietly. It wasn't promoted or sponsored. It didn't trend, but the impact was quiet and deep. People started sharing their own stories. Messages came in from nurses, janitors, grandmothers, foster parents, and old friends. Each one spoke of a Clara in their life. The ones who gave without expecting anything back. The ones who believed when no one else did. One message read, "My grandmother raised me while working 3 jobs. She never made it to my college graduation, but I wouldn't have gotten there without her." Another, "The librarian who let me stay late every night after school changed my life. I never told her thank you." And another, "To my dad who never finished school but worked nights to put me through medical school. I see you now. I love you." Soon, people began tagging those mentors. They sent flowers. They picked up the phone. A quiet wave of gratitude began rippling across the country, not because of a headline or a campaign, but because one story reminded everyone that the invisible matters. Clara didn't know most of this. She never had social media, but Jasmine printed out some of the letters for her. They sat on her coffee table now in a small basket next to her favorite tea tin. She read them slowly every morning, sometimes twice. One morning, Jasmine found her sitting there, smiling at a letter in her hands. "You okay, Grandma?" Clara nodded. "They're remembering," she whispered. "They're remembering the ones who always thought they'd be forgotten." And that, perhaps, was the most powerful legacy of all. Not the buildings, not the grants, not the gardens, but the reminder that love, quietly given, can echo louder than any applause. So if this story touched something inside you, if it reminded you of someone who helped shape your life, who gave you strength, or who quietly showed up when no one else did, don't wait. Reach out to them. Thank them. Share this story with someone who once made you feel seen. And tell us who is the Clara in your life. Because sometimes the most important heroes are the ones the world never sees, but the heart never forgets.